An entire Amish family of 6 vanished without explanation from their Lancaster County farmstead in 2001, leaving behind breakfast half-eaten on the table and livestock unfed in their pens. The local community searched for days, finding only a hastily written note in the father's hand, "We must go where God leads us." For 5 years, their sudden disappearance remained one of Pennsylvania's most perplexing mysteries, with most assuming they'd abandoned their faith to join the modern world. Then, on a crisp autumn morning in 2006, a team of archaeology students surveying historic farmlands made a discovery that would shatter every theory. Hidden beneath layers of dirt and straw in the abandoned barn, they uncovered a trapdoor, sealed shut and deliberately concealed. What they found in the underground chamber below would reveal a horrifying truth that had literally been beneath everyone's feet for 5 long years, and expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond the peaceful Amish community. If you've ever wondered what dark secrets might be hiding beneath seemingly peaceful rural communities, this story will chill you to your core. I've spent months researching this forgotten case, interviewing witnesses and examining evidence that was deliberately suppressed. What I uncovered left me sleepless for weeks. Before we dive deeper into this disturbing mystery, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you're new here. Where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. I'm always fascinated to see how far these forgotten stories reach across the globe. The early morning mist hung low over the rolling farmlands of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, casting an ethereal glow across fields that had been cultivated by Amish hands for generations. It was early autumn 2006, and the landscape was a patchwork of harvested fields, the occasional farmhouse with laundry fluttering on clotheslines, and horse-drawn buggies moving unhurriedly along narrow country roads. Professor Abigail Yoder stood at the edge of an overgrown property, clipboard in hand, watching as her archaeology students unloaded equipment from university vans. At 42, with streaks of gray beginning to thread through her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, she cut an imposing figure against the pastoral backdrop. Her black pants and sensible boots were already gathering the morning dew as she stepped through the tall grass toward what remained of the Bontrager farm. "Be careful with that ground-penetrating radar," she called to 2 students struggling with the equipment. "It costs more than your tuition." The students nodded nervously, moving with exaggerated care now. Abigail turned her attention back to the abandoned farmhouse and barn before her. Unlike the well-maintained Amish properties surrounding it, the Bontrager farm had fallen into disrepair. The white paint on the 2-story farmhouse had peeled and grayed. Shingles on the roof had worked loose, leaving patches where rain and snow had penetrated, causing visible water damage to the upper floor. The barn, once a proud structure of hand-hewn beams, leaned slightly to one side, its doors hanging ajar as if in perpetual welcome to visitors who never came. "Professor Yoder," called a student, a lanky young man named Noah with dark-rimmed glasses. "Is it true this is where that Amish family disappeared?" Abigail nodded slowly. "The Bontragers, Samuel, Ruth, and their 4 children. They vanished without a trace in 2001. "And no one ever found them?" asked another student, fascinated. "No," Abigail replied, her expression tightening. "The case went cold after a few weeks. The prevailing theory was that they chose to leave, to join the modern world or relocate to another Amish settlement." She didn't add that she had never believed that theory. The Bontragers had been devout, respected members of the community. Samuel Bontrager's carpentry had been sought after throughout the county. Ruth Bontrager's herbal remedies were trusted by Amish families for miles around. They had not been the type to abandon their faith or their community. The university had secured permission to survey the property as part of a larger project documenting historic Amish settlements in Pennsylvania. The farm had passed to Samuel's cousin after the disappearance, but no one had lived there since. After 5 years, the cousin had agreed to sell it to a land development company, but before construction could begin, an environmental and historical survey was required, which is why Abigail and her students were there. As they began setting up their equipment, an elderly Amish buggy approached slowly on the road. The elderly man at the reins pulled to a stop, regarding the activity with an unreadable expression. Abigail recognized Bishop Stoltzfus, the community leader who had reluctantly granted permission for their work. "Good morning, Bishop," she called, approaching the road. "Miss Yoder," he acknowledged with a slight nod. He never used her professional title, a subtle reminder of her choice to leave the community for education, a path he still disapproved of despite the years that had passed. "We'll be respectful of the property," she assured him. "This is purely academic research." "Some things are better left undisturbed," the bishop replied, his weathered face impassive beneath his broad-brimmed hat. "Some mysteries belong to God alone." Without waiting for her response, he flicked the reins and continued down the road, the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves fading into the morning stillness. Abigail watched him go, a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had grown up half in this world, half out of it. Her mother Amish, her father an outsider who had eventually drawn her mother away from the community. Abigail had spent summers here with grandparents until her teens, then returned as an adult scholar with a fascination for the culture she might have been fully part of in another life. She turned back to the abandoned Bontrager farm, unable to shake the feeling that Bishop Stoltzfus's words carried more warning than wisdom. After 5 years, the mystery of why no one in the community had been willing to purchase this otherwise valuable farmland lingered like the morning mist, present but impossible to grasp. "Let's get started," she called to her students. "We have a lot of ground to cover." Isaac Lapp's weathered hands trembled slightly as he poured coffee into a chipped mug at his kitchen table. At 63, his beard had gone mostly gray, the lines around his eyes deepened by years of outdoor work and more recently by worry. It was Isaac who had first reported the Bontragers missing on that strange morning in 2001. Samuel Bontrager had been married to Isaac's sister, Ruth, making Isaac the children's uncle and the family's closest relative in the settlement. "I never believed they left willingly," Isaac said, his voice soft but firm as he spoke to Abigail. She had sought him out after her first day at the farm, hoping his perspective might add context to their work. Samuel was not a man to abandon his responsibilities. The animals were unfed that morning. No true Amish farmer leaves livestock to suffer. Abigail nodded, making notes. "Tell me about Samuel and Ruth. What were they like?" Isaac gazed out the window at the clothesline where his wife Hannah was hanging laundry. Samuel was a gifted craftsman. His furniture was sought after even by the English. Quiet in his ways, but firm in his faith. He paused, collecting his thoughts. "Ruth, my sister, was wise beyond her years. She knew the old ways of healing, which plants to gather, how to prepare them. She kept to herself mostly, but was generous with her knowledge when needed." "And the children?" Abigail prompted gently. Daniel was 12, the oldest, already showing his father's talent with wood. Rebecca was 10, a serious child who helped her mother with the younger ones. Joseph was 6, always curious about everything. And little Anna, she was just 8 months old when they vanished. Outside, the clip-clop of an approaching buggy interrupted their conversation. Isaac glanced out the window, his expression changing subtly. "Bishop Stoltzfus," he murmured, rising from his chair. "He doesn't approve of discussions about the Bontragers." The bishop entered without knocking, as was his right as community leader. Tall and imposing, despite his 70 years, Stoltzfus commanded respect with his mere presence. His eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of Abigail. "Miss Yoder," he acknowledged stiffly, "I see you're continuing your, research." "Just gathering context, Bishop." Abigail replied evenly. "The university wants to document the historical significance of the farm before any development occurs." "The past is past," Stoltzfus said firmly. "Our ways teach us to look forward, not backward. Isn't that right, Isaac?" Isaac nodded, though Abigail noticed he wouldn't meet the bishop's eyes. "Yes, Bishop. The Bontrager matter was settled years ago. They chose to leave our community. We have accepted this as God's will." The conversation shifted to other matters, but Abigail couldn't help noticing the tension that remained in Isaac's shoulders, the way his eyes kept drifting to a family photograph on the wall. Samuel and Ruth Bontrager with their children, taken the summer before they vanished. Later that afternoon, Abigail made her way to the Lancaster County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Tom Miller was nearing retirement, but he had been the one to handle the Bontrager case 5 years earlier. She found him at his desk, looking much older than his 58 years, his once dark-haired, now completely silver. "Professor Yoder," he greeted her, gesturing to a chair. "Heard you were back in the county. Your archaeological survey, bringing up old ghosts." "You could say that," she replied, settling into the offered seat. "I'm interested in the Bontrager case." Miller leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. "Not much of a case to speak of. Family disappeared, left a note saying they were following God's calling. The Amish didn't want outside interference, and legally, there wasn't evidence of foul play." "But you had your doubts," Abigail suggested, watching his expression carefully. Miller's eyes, still sharp despite the tired lines surrounding them, met hers directly. "Let's just say things didn't add up. Samuel Bontrager wasn't the type to up and leave. His farm was prosperous, his standing in the community secure." He paused, "But the Amish handled their affairs internally. Bishop Stoltzfus made it clear our involvement wasn't welcome, beyond the initial report." "And the note, you're certain it was in Samuel's handwriting?" "Handwriting analysis isn't exactly standard procedure for a voluntary disappearance, especially when the community's spiritual leader is telling you to back off." He leaned forward. "Why the interest after all this time?" Abigail hesitated. "Just trying to understand the context of the farm for our documentation." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't the whole truth. Something about this case had always nagged at her, ever since she'd heard about it while working at the university. The disappearance had occurred during one of the periods when she'd been distant from her Amish relatives, focused on building her academic career. "Well," Miller said, reaching for a filing cabinet beside his desk. "Since you're asking," he pulled out a thin folder. "This is everything we have. Not much, I'm afraid. Statements from Isaac Lapp, who found the house empty, few photographs of the scene, copy of the note." He slid the folder across to her. "Maybe you'll see something we missed." As Abigail opened the folder, she was struck by how little official documentation existed for the disappearance of 6 people. The top photograph showed the Bontrager kitchen, a simple, clean space with a half-eaten breakfast still on the table. Bowls of porridge, cups of milk, a loaf of bread partially sliced. Whatever had cold them out had done so mid-meal. "It was like they vanished into thin air," Miller said quietly, as he watched her examine the photos. And no one in the community reported anything unusual that morning. Miller shook his head. "Not to us, at least. But then again," he let the thought hang unfinished. The unspoken reality hung between them. The Amish didn't readily share information with outsiders, even, perhaps especially, when those outsiders carried badges. The following morning found Abigail and her students back at the Bontrager farm, the weather cooler than the day before. As they set up their equipment, Abigail couldn't shake the images from Sheriff Miller's file, the abandoned breakfast, the cryptic note, the sense that something about this disappearance had never been properly investigated. "We'll start with grid mapping today," she instructed the students. "I want detailed records of every structure and feature on the property." While the students began their methodical work, Abigail made her way to the farmhouse. The door wasn't locked, few Amish homes were, though it creaked in protest as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with dust. The furniture remained, covered now in 5 years of grime. In the kitchen, the table had been cleared of the abandoned breakfast, but otherwise the room looked frozen in time. Abigail moved through the house carefully, noting details. Upstairs, the bedrooms told their own story. The parents' room was tidy, the bed made with a simple quilt. The children's rooms similarly showed no signs of hasty packing or disturbance. In the smallest bedroom, a handmade wooden crib still waited for its occupant, a tiny dress hanging on a peg nearby. Back outside, Abigail noticed Noah waving at her urgently near the barn. "Professor Yoder, you need to see this." She crossed the overgrown yard quickly. Noah and another student, Leah, had been mapping the barn's interior dimensions. "What is it?" Abigail asked, stepping into the cool dimness of the structure. "The dimensions don't make sense," Noah explained, showing her his measurements. "The interior space is significantly smaller than the exterior footprint suggests it should be." Abigail examined his notes, her interest piqued. "Good catch. That suggests there might be a hidden space or a false wall." "That's what I thought," Noah agreed, "but we've checked all the walls and they're solid." "What about the floor?" Abigail suggested, looking down at the dirt and straw covering the barn's surface. They spent the next hour carefully clearing sections of the floor, looking for any irregularities. It was Leah who found it. A slight difference in the packed earth near the back of the barn, partially concealed by old hay bales and a broken plow. "There's something here," she called, brushing away decades of accumulated dirt. Abigail and Noah joined her, and together they cleared more of the area, revealing the edges of what appeared to be a wooden trapdoor, deliberately covered and concealed. A rusted iron ring lay flush with the wood, serving as a handle. "Root cellars aren't uncommon in these old farms," Abigail said, though something in her voice betrayed uncertainty. "But they're usually accessed from the house or a separate entrance, not hidden in the barn." Noah reached for the iron ring, but Abigail stopped him. "Wait, let's document this properly first." They photographed the trapdoor from multiple angles before attempting to lift it. When they finally did, the wood groaned in protest, revealing a set of crude steps descending into darkness. The musty odor that rose from below carried a disturbing undercurrent that made them all step back. "Get the flashlights from the van," Abigail instructed, trying to keep her voice steady, "and call the rest of the team over." With proper lighting, Abigail led the way down the steps, instructing her students to touch nothing. What they found was not a typical root cellar, but a carefully constructed underground chamber, about 15 feet square. Shelves lined one wall, stocked with preserved food in jars, most now spoiled and leaking. A small table stood in the center with simple benches. Along another wall, 6 pallets were arranged on the floor, each with Amish clothing neatly folded beside them. "What is this place?" whispered Leah, her voice tight with unease. Abigail didn't answer immediately, her flashlight beam playing across the space, catching details that made her stomach clench. A child's wooden toy beside one of the smaller pallets, a woman's prayer covering, a Bible open to the Book of Psalms. Then her light found what lay on the pallets themselves, and she heard Noah gasp behind her. 6 figures lay in perfect stillness, their bodies desiccated but largely preserved in the cool, dry underground air. They were dressed in traditional Amish clothing, the adults in dark blues and blacks, the children in simpler versions of the same. Their faces, though withered, were peaceful, as if they had simply lain down to sleep. "Oh my God," whispered Leah, turning away. Abigail forced herself to look closely at each figure, confirming what she already knew in her heart. The tallest male, Samuel Bontrager. Beside him, his wife, Ruth. And arranged in decreasing size, their 4 children, even baby Anna, tiny in death. "Everyone back upstairs," Abigail ordered, her voice shaking despite her effort to remain professional. "Noah, call Sheriff Miller. Tell him we've found the Bontragers." The discovery transformed the quiet Bontrager farm into a hive of activity. Sheriff Miller arrived within 30 minutes, bringing deputies, forensic technicians, and the county medical examiner. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off the barn, and uniformed officers established a perimeter around the property. Abigail met Miller at his car, her face pale but composed. "They're all there, Sheriff, the entire family." Miller's expression was grim as he gathered his team for a briefing. "Nobody touches anything without proper documentation. This is now a potential crime scene spanning back 5 years." News traveled fast in the small community. By mid-afternoon, a small crowd of English onlookers had gathered at the road, held back by deputies. More concerning to Abigail was the group of Amish men who arrived in buggies, standing in a solemn cluster at the property's edge. Among them, she recognized Isaac Lapp and Bishop Stoltzfus. Sheriff Miller approached them, speaking briefly. Abigail couldn't hear the exchange, but she saw Isaac's face crumple as the sheriff confirmed what they had found. The bishop's expression remained inscrutable, though she thought she detected something like fear in his eyes before he turned away. Inside the barn, the technical team worked methodically to document the scene before any bodies were removed. Dr. Natalie Foster, the county medical examiner, descended into the chamber with her equipment, emerging an hour later looking troubled. "Preliminary findings?" Miller asked quietly as they stepped away from the others. "They've been dead approximately 5 years, consistent with when they disappeared," Dr. Foster replied. "Cause of death isn't immediately apparent, no visible trauma. I'll need to conduct proper autopsies." "Could it have been suicide? A religious thing, maybe?" Dr. Foster hesitated. "Possible, but..." She glanced toward the barn. "The trap door was designed to be secured from the outside, not the inside." This detail hung heavy in the air between them. Abigail, who had joined them, felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air. They weren't hiding. They were imprisoned. As the day progressed, more details emerged. The underground chamber had been carefully constructed, with ventilation shafts too small for escape, disguised as groundhog holes in the surrounding field. The food supply suggested preparation for a long stay or imprisonment. And most disturbing of all, scratches on the underside of the trapdoor indicated desperate attempts to escape. By evening, the bodies had been carefully removed and transported to the county morgue. Abigail stood with Sheriff Miller near the police tape as the last of the medical examiner's vehicles pulled away. "What happens now?" "Full investigation," Miller replied grimly. "This just became the biggest case in Lancaster County history." A commotion at the property edge drew their attention. Isaac Lapp was arguing with Bishop Stoltzfus, their raised voices carrying across the yard. Deputies moved toward them, but Miller waved them off, instead walking over himself with Abigail following. "Knew something wasn't right," Isaac was saying, his face flushed with emotion. "We should have looked harder." "Calm yourself, Isaac," the bishop responded sternly. "This is God's will we're witnessing." "God's will?" Isaac's voice broke. "My sister and her children were trapped in a hole in the ground.
How was that God's will? Miller stepped between them. Gentlemen, I understand this is difficult, but I need both of you to go home now. We'll have questions in the coming days. The bishop straightened, regaining his composure. Of course, Sheriff. Isaac will return home to reflect and pray. He placed a firm hand on Isaac's shoulder. Won't you, brother? Isaac shrugged away from the touch, his eyes red-rimmed but suddenly wary. He nodded once, turned without another word, and walked to his buggy. As the Amish dispersed, Abigail noticed something fall from Isaac's pocket, a folded piece of paper that fluttered to the ground unnoticed. Once he had driven away, she retrieved it, intending to return it the next day. Curiosity got the better of her, however, and she unfolded it carefully. It was a photograph, creased and worn as if handled often. It showed Samuel Bontrager standing proudly before his barn with a man in a business suit, a developer of some kind, judging by the rolled blueprints under his arm. Both men were smiling, shaking hands. On the back, written in faded ink, Samuel refuses final offer. Pressure must increase. .BS. The initials sent a chill through Abigail. Bishop Stoltzfus. She quickly refolded the photograph and slipped it into her pocket, her mind racing. Whatever had happened to the Bontrager family, it seemed the bishop might have known more than he had ever revealed.
By the following morning, news of the discovery had spread throughout Lancaster County and beyond. Reporters gathered at the police line, cameras trained on the Bontrager farm. Sheriff Miller held a brief press conference, confirming only that 6 bodies had been found and that the investigation was ongoing. In the county morgue, Dr. Foster began the painstaking process of examining the remains. Abigail had been asked to assist, given her archaeological expertise in handling preserved remains. Together, they documented each body's condition, while technicians photographed and collected trace evidence. "The preservation is remarkable," Dr. Foster noted, examining Samuel Bontrager's remains. "The cool, dry conditions in that chamber created a natural mummification process." Abigail nodded, her trained eye noticing details. No signs of struggle or restraint. Whatever happened, they weren't physically bound. "Yet they couldn't escape," Dr. Foster murmured, gesturing to the small scrapes and splinters embedded in Samuel's fingertips, evidence of attempts to claw at the trap door. When they moved to Ruth Bontrager's remains, Dr. Foster paused, her expression changing. "Look at this discoloration around the mouth and nostrils." Abigail leaned closer. "What does it indicate?" "Possibly poison," the medical examiner replied. "I'm taking samples for toxicology, but this is consistent with certain types of poisoning." They found similar discoloration on all 6 bodies. More disturbing was what they discovered in the preserved food jars brought from the chamber. When tested, several showed traces of a powerful sedative mixed with the food. "They were drugged," Dr. Foster concluded grimly, "probably to keep them compliant." Sheriff Miller, who had joined them for the preliminary findings, shook his head in disgust. "So someone built that chamber, stocked it with drugged food, and trapped an entire family inside to die slowly?" "That's what the evidence suggests," Dr. Foster confirmed. "The sedative would have made them increasingly lethargic, eventually affecting their breathing. Combined with the limited oxygen in that space, the implications hung heavy in the morgue's sterile air." Abigail had been turning something over her mind since the discovery. "Sheriff, the note found in the house when they disappeared. We must go where God leads us. Have you still got it?" Miller nodded. "In evidence. Why?" "I'd like to compare it to known samples of Samuel's handwriting." Later that day, a document examiner confirmed what Abigail had suspected. The note had not been written by Samuel Bontrager. The handwriting was similar, but distinctly different. Someone had attempted to forge his script. Meanwhile, deputies executing a search warrant at the Bontrager house made another discovery. Hidden in a hollow section of floorboard beneath Ruth's bed, they found a small journal, its pages filled with her neat, precise handwriting. The final entry was dated the day before the family's disappearance. Samuel refuses to sell, despite the threats. The men came again today, the English developer and the bishop. They spoke of progress, of the greater good. Samuel spoke of our heritage, our way of life. The bishop's eyes were cold when they left. I fear what comes next. God protect my children. Miller showed the journal to Abigail in his office later that day, his expression grave. This changes everything. We're looking at premeditated murder, possibly conspiracy. Abigail nodded, thinking of the photograph in her pocket. She placed it on Miller's desk. I found this yesterday. It fell from Isaac Lopp's pocket. Miller examined it carefully, his eyes narrowing at the note on the back. The S, Bishop Stoltzfus, and the man with Samuel. I don't recognize him, but he's clearly a developer of some kind. Miller reached for his phone. We need to bring Isaac Lapp in for questioning, and I want a background check on every development company that's operated in this county in the last decade. As Miller made his calls, Abigail returned to the university to check their records. The archaeology department maintained archives of regional development proposals as part of their cultural preservation efforts. She spent hours searching through files until she found what she was looking for. A proposal dated 2000 for a large shopping complex and housing development that would have required acquiring several Amish farms, including the Bontrager property, which sat at a critical junction for the planned access road. The proposal had been withdrawn in late 2001, with no reason given. The development company, Lancaster Valley Partners, had dissolved shortly thereafter, its assets acquired by a larger corporation based in Philadelphia. When she returned to the sheriff's office with her findings, she found Miller interviewing Isaac Lapp. Through the one-way glass, she could see Isaac looked haggard, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. I didn't know what happened to them, I swear, he was saying, his voice cracking. I found the note, saw the empty house. I believed what we were all told, that they had chosen to leave. But you kept this photograph, Miller said, sliding the evidence bag containing the photo across the table. Why? Isaac stared at it, then closed his eyes briefly. Because something felt wrong. Samuel had told me about the developers pressuring him to sell. The bishop was involved somehow, acting as an intermediary. And the note on the back, pressure must increase. What did that mean to you? I didn't know, Isaac insisted. I found it among Samuel's papers when we cleaned out the house. I kept it because it was the only thing that suggested something wasn't right about their disappearance. Why didn't you bring this to us 5 years ago? Miller pressed. His expression showed his internal struggle. The bishop, he told us it was a community matter, that involving the English authorities would only bring trouble. He looked up, his eyes suddenly clear. I was wrong to listen. May God forgive me.
Miller ended the interview shortly after, instructing deputies to escort Isaac home, but to keep him under observation. Outside the interview room, he conferred with Abigail. "Do you believe him?" she asked. Miller sighed. "I think he suspected something, but couldn't bring himself to defy the bishop or question his community's ways." He gestured to the files she had brought. What did you find? Abigail explained about Lancaster Valley Partners and the development proposal. The timing fits perfectly. The proposal was withdrawn shortly after the Bontraggers disappeared. And now, 5 years later, another developer wants to build on the same land, Miller noted grimly. That can't be coincidence. The question is, how deeply was Bishop Stoltzfus involved, and who else might have known what really happened? Miller gathered his team for a briefing. I want the bishop brought in for questioning, but handle it carefully. We don't need to antagonize the entire Amish community. And get me everything you can find on Lancaster Valley Partners, especially who was running it in 2001. As the investigation accelerated, Abigail couldn't shake the image of the Bontrager family in that underground chamber, slowly succumbing to poisoned food and failing oxygen, their desperate scratches on the trapdoor, their final communication with the world above. The next day brought complications. When deputies arrived at Bishop Stoltzfus's farm to question him, they found him gone. His wife, a thin, nervous woman with downcast eyes, claimed he had left before dawn to visit an Amish settlement in Ohio, a trip she insisted had been planned for weeks. Sheriff Miller was skeptical. "Convenient timing," he remarked to Abigail as they drove back to the station. "I've put out an alert to departments along the likely routes, but finding an Amish man traveling by buggy or bus isn't easy." At the station, new information was waiting. The forensic accountant Miller had assigned to trace Lancaster Valley Partners had discovered that the company had been primarily owned by a Philadelphia investment group, with a local businessman named Howard Becker serving as the public face of the development project. Becker, Miller mused, studying the photograph. That could be him with Samuel Bontrager. A deputy came in with a report. "Sir, we've located Howard Becker. He's living in Arizona now, retired. Local PD has agreed to question him." "Good," Miller nodded. "And what about the current development company interested in the Bontrager land?" "Pine Creek Developers," the deputy replied, checking his notes. "They're a subsidiary of Keystone Holdings, which is owned by Northeastern Investments, which is the same company that acquired Lancaster Valley Partners' assets after it dissolved." Abigail connected the dots. "It's the same people, just hiding behind different corporate names." Miller reached for the phone. "Get me a warrant for Pine Creek's offices. I want every document they have related to that land." While they waited for the warrant, Abigail returned to the Morgan to review Dr. Foster's findings. The toxicology results had confirmed their suspicions. The preserved food contained a powerful sedative called phenobarbital, commonly used in both human and veterinary medicine. "It would have made them increasingly drowsy," Dr. Foster explained. "Eventually, combined with the limited oxygen in that sealed space, respiratory depression would have set in. They would have simply fallen asleep and never woken up." "A peaceful death, at least," Abigail murmured, small comfort though it was. "For the adults, perhaps," Dr. Foster agreed grimly. "But the children died first. Based on the differential decomposition, I'd estimate the youngest, baby Anna, died within 24 to 48 hours. The other children followed over the next few days. The parents survived the longest, perhaps a week." The image of Samuel and Ruth Bontrager watching their children die one by one, unable to save them, struck Abigail with physical force. She steadied herself against the examination table. "There's something else," Dr. Foster added, her voice softening. "Ruth Bontrager's fingers showed more damage than anyone else's, deeper scratches, broken nails. She fought the hardest to get out, probably after her children began dying." Abigail closed her eyes briefly, imagining the mother's desperate attempts to save her family. Back at the station, the warrant for Pine Creek Developers had been executed. Deputies returned with boxes of documents and several computers. The company's offices had been surprisingly empty. Employees claimed their senior management had called an unexpected retreat the previous day, taking key personnel to a conference in New York. "Another convenient absence," Miller observed dryly. They began sorting through the documents, looking for anything connecting Pine Creek to the original development plan or to the Bontragers. Among the files, they found maps of the proposed development, architectural renderings, and financial projections. One document in particular caught Abigail's attention: a list of property acquisitions with status updates. "Look at this," she said, pointing to an entry for the Bontrager farm. Next to it was a single word: resolved. Resolved, Miller repeated, his jaw tightening. That's what they called murdering an entire family. As they continued searching, a technician from the computer forensics unit arrived with a breakthrough. Sir, we've recovered deleted emails from one of the seized computers. There's correspondence dating back to 2001 between Howard Becker and someone identified only as BS, using a private email account. BS, Abigail said softly. Bishop Stoltzfus.
Miller and Abigail exchanged glances. Bishop Stoltzfus. The emails painted a disturbing picture. Becker had been frustrated by Samuel Bontrager's refusal to sell his strategically located farm. The bishop, serving as an intermediary, had initially tried to persuade Samuel through community pressure. When that failed, the emails turned darker. "We need to resolve this obstacle," Becker had written in one message. "The entire project hinges on acquiring that access point. There are ways to handle these matters within our community, but it will require resources and absolute discretion." The final email in the exchange, dated 3 days before the Bontragers disappeared, was chilling in its brevity. Arrangements made. Problem will be permanently resolved. Miller called the Arizona Police Department requesting that Howard Becker be taken into custody immediately for questioning. Then he turned to his team. "I want a full background check on Bishop Stoltzfus, financial records, travel history, everything. This goes beyond just pressuring Bontrager to sell. He was actively involved in eliminating them." As night fell, Abigail found herself drawn back to the Bontrager farm. The crime scene tape still surrounded the barn, but the property was quiet now, the technical teams having completed their initial work. She stood at the edge of the farmyard, trying to reconcile the peaceful setting with the horror that had unfolded there. A sound behind her made her turn. Isaac Lapp stood a few feet away, his buggy parked on the road. "I knew you would come back here," he said quietly. "You're like Ruth that way. You need to understand things, to see them with your own eyes." "You knew my mother," Abigail said. It wasn't a question. Isaac nodded. "And you, when you were small, before your father took you both away." He gazed at the farmhouse, its windows dark. "I should have done more to help them." "What happened, Isaac? What do you know?" Isaac was silent for a long moment. The bishop came to Samuel first, speaking of opportunity, of securing the community's future by selling to the developers. When Samda refused, others were sent, Englishmen in suits with maps and numbers. "Howard Becker," Abigail supplied. "Yes, him. And others. They offered more money each time. Samuel still refused." Isaac's voice grew strained. Then the bishop began speaking in meeting about resistance to God's will, about the sin of pride in holding to one's own desires against the good of all. He was turning the community against Samuel, Abigail realized. "Some," Isaac acknowledged, "not all, but enough that Samuel began to feel isolated. Still, he would not sell." He paused. "The night before they disappeared, I visited them. Samuel told me men had threatened him, suggested his children might have accidents if he continued to resist." "Did he report this to the sheriff?" Isaac shook his head. "Our ways, we handle things internally. Samuel said he would speak to the bishop one final time, make him understand his position. That was the last time I saw him. And the next morning, I came to borrow a tool. Found the house empty, breakfast still on the table. The note was there on the kitchen counter." Isaac's eyes filled with tears. "I never believed they left willingly, but I couldn't imagine this." He gestured toward the barn. "Why didn't you tell Sheriff Miller this 5 years ago?" Abigail asked, though she already knew the answer. "Fear," Isaac admitted simply. "The bishop said it was God's will, that they had chosen to leave. To question that," he shook his head. "But I should have. God forgive me, I should have." As Isaac turned to leave, he added one final disturbing detail. There were others who resisted selling, the Millers, the Zooks. They all eventually changed their minds after the Bontraegers disappeared. All sold within a year. Or suffered the same fate, Abigail said quietly. Isaac's expression confirmed her suspicion. Check the other properties, Miss Yoder. God knows what else lies beneath the soil of our community. The investigation expanded rapidly over the next day. Sheriff Miller obtained warrants to search the properties Isaac had mentioned, farms that had been sold to developers after initially resisting. Ground-penetrating radar revealed no underground chambers similar to the one at the Bontrager farm, but at the former Miller property, now a half-constructed shopping center, cadaver dogs alerted to an area near an old well. Excavation revealed the remains of Eli and Mary Miller, an elderly Amish couple who had supposedly moved to an Amish settlement in Indiana in 2002. Their deaths appeared different from the Bontraegers. Blunt force trauma to the skulls suggested a more direct method of murder. They're escalating, Miller said grimly, as they watched the bodies being recovered. They're getting bolder, less concerned with making the deaths appear natural or accidental.
Howard Becker had been taken into custody in Arizona and was being transported back to Pennsylvania. His initial denials had crumbled when confronted with the recovered emails. He was now negotiating through his attorney, offering information in exchange for consideration in charging. Abigail had been working with her university contacts to trace the bishop's movements. She discovered that Stoltzfus had made several trips outside the Amish community in the months surrounding the Bontrager disappearance. Unusual for a man who preached strict separation from the modern world. More tellingly, bank records showed a series of cash deposits to his modest account in the weeks after the family vanished, totaling just over $50,000. Blood money, Miller said when she showed him the records, paid to eliminate the obstacles to their development. The bishop remained at large, though sightings had been reported in several Amish communities across Ohio and Indiana. Miller had coordinated with authorities in those states, but the close-knit nature of Amish settlements made locating him difficult. Many were reluctant to assist English law enforcement, especially against one of their own spiritual leaders. Abigail returned to the university to find a plain white envelope had been left on her office door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message in handwritten Pennsylvania Dutch. Silence protects the guilty. The chamber was built by Stoltzfus Construction, owned by the bishop's brother. Look to the other projects they completed in 2001. She immediately took the note to Sheriff Miller, who had the handwriting analyzed. Not the bishop, the expert concluded, but similar characteristics to Isaac Lapp's writing. He is still afraid to come forward directly, Abigail observed. Miller immediately requested records for all projects completed by Stoltzfus Construction in 2001. The company had primarily built barns and outbuildings for Amish farms, but had also done work for several English businesses, including renovation of a storage facility owned by Lancaster Valley Partners. Deputies were dispatched to the storage facility, now abandoned and scheduled for demolition. Using the ground-penetrating radar borrowed from the university, they discovered another underground chamber beneath the concrete floor, similar in construction to the one at the Bontrager farm, but larger and empty of remains. A prototype, Miller suggested as they examined the space. They perfected their method here before using it on the Bontragers. The technical evidence was mounting, but Miller knew they needed more to ensure convictions. The breakthrough came unexpectedly
when Howard Becker arrived in Lancaster County and immediately offered a full confession in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. Becker's statement was damning. The development project hinged on acquiring several key properties, with the Bontrager farm being the most crucial due to its location at the entrance to the complex. When Samuel refused multiple offers, Becker had turned to Bishop Stoltzfus, who had initially promised to use his influence to persuade the reluctant farmer. Stoltzfus came to me with the idea, Becker admitted during his recorded statement. He said if the family simply disappeared, the property would eventually transfer to relatives who might be more amenable to selling. He said he could make it happen in a way that would look like they'd chosen to leave. "And you agreed to this plan?" Miller asked. "I provided the funding, $50,000. I told myself I didn't know exactly what he planned to do, that maybe he was just going to pressure them to relocate." He paused. "But I knew. God help me. I knew." According to Becker, the bishop had arranged everything, having his brother's construction company build the underground chamber beneath the barn, acquiring the sedatives through a veterinary supplier who served the Amish community, and ultimately luring the family into the trap. "How did he get them into the chamber?" Miller pressed. "He told me they were planning to have a secret church meeting there. The Bontragers were becoming more traditional, rejecting some of the bishop's more progressive positions. Stoltzfus said he convinced them the chamber would be a safe place to hold their meeting away from his influence." Becker's voice broke. "I never imagined it would be an entire family. Children." The confession provided the motive and method, but one key player remained missing: Bishop Stoltzfus himself. As news of the investigation spread, the Amish community had withdrawn further, many refusing to speak to authorities at all. The code of silence that had protected the bishop for 5 years continued to shield him now. Abigail, however, had one advantage: her half-Amish heritage and family connections. Through her grandmother, who still lived within the community, she arranged a meeting with several elders who had become increasingly troubled by the revelations.
The meeting took place in her grandmother's simple home, away from official settings that might intimidate the Amish participants. 5 men attended, all respected community members who had known Samuel Bontrager well. "What the bishop did was not of God," said an elder, his weathered face solemn beneath his beard. "To use our ways, our faith, as a shield for murder, this cannot stand." "Do you know where he might be hiding?" Abigail asked gently. The men exchanged glances. Finally, the eldest spoke. "There is a hunting cabin in the mountains near Hershey. It belongs to his family. Few know of it because it lies outside our community lands." "Will you help us bring him to justice?" Abigail pressed. Another long silence followed. Then, one by one, the men nodded. "Not for the English law," clarified the first elder, "but for Samuel and Ruth and their little ones, for the truth that must come to light." Abigail relayed this information to Sheriff Miller, who immediately organized a team to raid the cabin. As they prepared to depart, an unexpected visitor arrived at the station. Isaac Lapp, his expression resolute despite his obvious fear. "I will go with you," he announced. "The bishop knows me. Perhaps he will surrender peacefully if he sees a familiar face." Miller was reluctant, but eventually agreed, recognizing the value of having an Amish intermediary. Abigail also joined the convoy as they set out for the remote cabin in the gathering dusk. The cabin stood alone in a clearing, a plume of smoke rising from its chimney, the only sign of occupation. Officers surrounded the property silently, while Miller, Isaac and Abigail approached the front door. "Bishop Stoltzfus," Miller called out, his hand on his holstered weapon. "This is Sheriff Miller. We need you to come out with your hands visible." Silence answered him. Miller was about to signal his officers to move in when the door creaked open. Bishop Stoltzfus stood framed in the doorway, his tall figure unbowed despite his circumstances. "You knew I would come eventually," he said, his eyes finding Isaac. "Brother Lapp, you have chosen the English way over your own people. I have chosen truth over deception, God's truth, not your twisted version of it." The bishop's gaze shifted to Abigail. "The woman who walks between worlds. I should have known you would be trouble when you returned." His eyes hardened. "Just like your mother, unable to accept God's plan." "Murder was never God's plan," Abigail replied evenly. "You used faith to cover greed and violence." "I did what was necessary for our community to survive," Stoltzfus insisted. "The world presses in on all sides. Without compromise, without adaptation, we will be swept away." "Compromise?" Isaac's voice rose in anger. "You murdered my sister and her children. You buried them alive." Something shifted in the bishop's expression. Not remorse exactly, but a flicker of recognition. Samuel would not bend. His stubbornness threatened everything. The development would have brought money, protection, influence. We needed that land. "Put your hands where I can see them," Miller instructed, moving forward with handcuffs ready. For a moment, it seemed the bishop might resist. Then, with surprising dignity, he extended his wrists. "You cannot judge me by your laws. What I did was for my people." "No," Isaac said, as Miller secured the handcuffs. "You did it for money. 50,000 pieces of silver, the price of my family's lives." As they led Stoltzfus to the waiting police car, Abigail noticed something clutched in his hand, a small book bound in leather. When Miller took it as evidence, they discovered it was a personal journal filled with the bishop's neat script. The final pages detailed not remorse, but frustration that the development had been delayed by the investigation into the Bontrager's disappearance, forcing the investors to wait 5 years before trying again with a new company name. "He saw it as a business setback," Abigail said in disbelief as they drove back to Lancaster. "Nothing more." "Some men can justify anything," Miller replied grimly, "even evil done in the God's name." The arrest of Bishop Stoltzfus sent shockwaves through the Amish community. Some refused to believe the charges, insisting there must be a mistake or misunderstanding. Others, particularly those who knew the Bontragers well, accepted the terrible truth with quiet grief. Howard Becker's cooperation had led investigators to additional conspirators. The veterinarian who had supplied the sedatives, knowing their intended use. A lawyer who had helped create the complex web of companies to hide the developers' identities. And most disturbingly, 2 other Amishmen who had helped the bishop construct the underground chamber and lure the family into it.
A week after the arrests, the county held a formal inquest. The courthouse was filled beyond capacity, with Amish and English sitting side by side to hear the official findings. Dr. Foster presented the medical evidence, explaining in clinical terms how the family had died. Forensic accountants detailed the money trail leading from development companies to the bishop's accounts. Howard Becker testified about the planning that had gone into eliminating the obstacles to their project. The most powerful testimony, however, came from Isaac Lapp. Dressed in his simple Amish clothing, he spoke of his sister Ruth's concerns in the weeks before the disappearance, of Samuel's refusal to compromise his principles, of the children who had been caught in a tragedy engineered by greed. "They trusted their community,"
Isaac said, his voice steady despite his evident emotion. They trusted their spiritual leader. That trust was betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. During a recess in the proceedings, Abigail found herself standing beside Sheriff Miller as they watched the bishop being led back to his holding cell. "He still shows no remorse," Miller observed, "claims he was acting for the greater good of his people." "The ultimate corruption," Abigail replied, "convincing yourself that evil serves a higher purpose." The inquest concluded with the medical examiner's official determination: homicide by unlawful confinement, leading to poisoning and asphyxiation. Criminal charges were filed against all involved: first-degree murder for Bishop Stoltzfus and his direct accomplices, conspiracy charges for the developers and those who had facilitated the plan. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Following information in the bishop's journal, investigators had obtained warrants to search a warehouse owned by Stoltzfus Construction. There, they discovered architectural plans for additional underground chambers, identical to the one that had entombed the Bontraggers, along with a list of potential targets for future development phases. "He was planning to do it again," Miller told Abigail as they examined the evidence. "Multiple families, all positioned on land the developers wanted." The list included a dozen Amish families across Lancaster County, each one noted as resistant to selling. Next to each name was a proposed resolution date and a designated team of trusted community members who would help implement the plan. This wasn't just about the Bontraggers, Abigail realized, horror washing over her. This was going to be systematic elimination of anyone who stood in the way of development. The final piece fell into place when forensic accountants traced a series of payments from an offshore account to the bishop's brother over a 5-year period, consulting fees that aligned perfectly with the planned resolution dates for the targeted families. They were paying him to keep quiet and to be ready when they decided to restart the project, Miller concluded. "Our discovery of the Bontraggers just happened before they could implement the next phase." The evidence was presented to the grand jury, which returned indictments against 23 individuals connected to the conspiracy, from the bishop and his accomplices to corporate executives who had authorized the payments and plans. As the case moved toward trial, Abigail found herself drawn back to the Bontrager farm one final time. The university had withdrawn from the archaeology project out of respect for the tragedy, but she felt compelled to see the site once more before returning to her academic work. The farm stood quiet in the late afternoon light. The crime scene tape had been removed, the technical teams long gone. The barn door hung open, the exposed trapdoor now permanently sealed by order of the court. As she stood contemplating the ordinary appearance of a place that had witnessed such extraordinary evil, she noticed a buggy approaching. Isaac Lapp pulled to a stop nearby and joined her, his expression solemn. "The community has decided," he said, without preamble. "The Bontraggers will be laid to rest in our cemetery with proper ceremony. The bishop's supporters protested, but they were overruled." "That's good," Abigail replied softly. "They deserve to rest among their people." Isaac nodded, then gestured toward the property. "The land will be sold, but not for development. Several families are pooling resources to purchase it for community use, perhaps a school or meeting house. He paused. A place of life, not death. "What will happen to the underground chamber?" Abigail asked. "Filled with concrete," Isaac replied firmly. "Buried forever, though we will never forget what happened there." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle whickering of Isaac's horse. "Your mother would be proud," Isaac said finally, "of what you've done here." Abigail felt unexpected tears pricking her eyes. "I hope so." "Will you come," he asked, "to the burial service?" Abigail hesitated, aware of the complicated position she occupied, neither fully Amish nor fully separate. Would it be appropriate? "You helped find them," Isaac said simply. "You helped bring truth to light. Yes, it would be appropriate." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the abandoned farm, Abigail made her peace with the place and the tragedy it had witnessed. The Bontrager family had been silenced by greed and corruption, buried beneath the very land they had refused to surrender. But they had been found. Their story would be told, and justice, imperfect as it might be, would be served.
3 months later, on a clear winter morning, the Amish community gathered for the burial of the Bontrager family. By tradition, Amish funerals are held in the home, but given the circumstances, the service took place in a large barn belonging to Isaac Lapp. Hundreds attended, not only Amish, but also English neighbors who had known the family and been horrified by their fate. The 6 simple wooden coffins, crafted by Amish carpenters using traditional methods, stood in a row at the front of the space. No flowers adorned them, in keeping with Amish custom, but each bore a small carved plaque with the name of its occupant. Samuel, Ruth, Daniel, Rebecca, Joseph, and little Anna, together in death as they had been in life. The service was conducted in Pennsylvania Dutch, the hymns sung without instrumental accompaniment, the prayers offered in the ancient patterns of their faith. Abigail sat with her grandmother near the back, her modern clothing setting her apart, but her presence accepted as Isaac had promised. After the service, the coffins were transported by horse-drawn wagon to the community cemetery, where 6 graves had been prepared side by side. As was traditional, the men of the community took turns with shovels, filling the graves by hand, while the women stood in silent witness. Sheriff Miller attended in plain clothes, standing respectfully at a distance. When the burial was complete, he approached Abigail. "The trial starts next week," he said quietly. "The prosecution believes the evidence is overwhelming." Abigail nodded. "Will you need me to testify?" "About the archaeological findings, yes, and your discovery of that photograph." Miller hesitated. "The community seems to be healing." "In their way," Abigail agreed, watching as Amish families began to disperse, returning to buggies for the journey home. "They face it with faith and acceptance, but they won't forget." The trials proceeded through the winter and into spring. Bishop Stoltzfus maintained his stance that he had acted for the good of the community, but the evidence against him was insurmountable. Howard Becker's testimony, the financial records, the bishop's own journal, and the physical evidence from the underground chamber left no room for reasonable doubt. In May, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all counts. The bishop was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. His accomplices received similar sentences, while the corporate conspirators faced lengthy prison terms and massive financial penalties. The land development scheme that had cost the Bontrager family their lives had collapsed entirely. The properties acquired through intimidation and murder were placed in a trust, with proceeds from their eventual sale designated for a victim compensation fund. For Abigail, the case had profound personal implications. Her work on the investigation had drawn her closer to her Amish relatives, bridging a gap that had existed since her childhood. She began documenting Amish oral histories with their permission, stories that might otherwise be lost as the modern world continued to encroach on their traditional way of life. Sheriff Miller retired the following year, the Bontrager case having taken both a professional and personal toll. At his retirement ceremony, he spoke briefly about the investigation. "Some cases change you," he told the gathered crowd. "They remind you why the work matters, why truth must always come to the light, no matter how long it takes or how deeply it's buried." Isaac Lapp continued his quiet life in the Amish community, but with a new purpose. He established a foundation in his sister's name to help Amish families resist development pressure and preserve their agricultural way of life. When developers approached with offers, the foundation provided legal assistance and support, ensuring that decisions to sell or hold were truly free choices, not coerced through intimidation or threats. The underground chamber that had been the Bontrager's tomb was indeed filled with concrete, the barn above it eventually dismantled. In its place, the community erected a simple stone marker, with no names, no dates, just a verse from Psalms in Pennsylvania Dutch. "Truth shall spring out of the earth, and righteousness shall look down from heaven." 5 years after the discovery, Abigail published her academic work on the case, with the blessing of the Amish elders. Titled "Buried Truths, Development, Coercion, and Community Resistance in Rural America," it became required reading in archaeology and ethics courses nationwide. The book's final chapter described the dedication of a small museum exhibit about the case at Lancaster County Historical Society. Among the artifacts displayed was the journal Ruth Bontrager had hidden beneath her floorboards, open to her final entry. Beside it stood a small wooden toy horse, carefully preserved, the last thing Daniel Bontrager had carved under his father's guidance. The Bontrager family died because they refused to surrender their heritage and their home. Their story reminds us that progress without conscience is not progress at all, and the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually find its way to the light. Some tragedies remain buried for years, hidden beneath layers of silence, fear, and complicity. The Bontrager family might have remained forever entombed in that underground chamber, their fate unknown, their story untold, if not for the persistence of those who refused to accept comfortable lies. Their story reminds us that justice often comes slowly, that it requires courage to question authority and tradition when necessary, and that the most dangerous predators are often those we trust most completely. If this story affected you as deeply as it did me during my research, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Last Seen Stories for more forgotten cases brought back into the light. Where are you watching from? And have there been similar cases of development pressures turning deadly in your area? Let me know in the comments below. Next week, we'll explore the mysterious disappearance of a park ranger who vanished while investigating strange lights in a remote section of Yellowstone, only to reappear 3 years later with no memory of where he'd been, but with evidence that would expose decades of illegal activity in America's most famous national park. Until then, remember, not all who vanish choose to disappear, and sometimes the truth is buried right beneath our feet.